Hello everyone, I hope you're doing well. I wanted to do a new video today where instead of scripting something and going into depth in a novel or the reader's guide, I wanted to do a new series on the channel where I take something that I don't think is worth a full deep dive per se, but is interesting enough. Either it's a pet peeve of mine or it's something that I'm passionate about when it comes to art or criticism, and just talk about it basically in a less scripted, less formal way. Also, this can be an opportunity, I think, for us to discuss topics that you might be interested in hearing me talk about as well. So if there are any things, whether it's to do with art or literary criticism, or maybe it's a review of a book that's scathing, that I like the book, that you want me to react to, anything of that kind, let me know in the comments. I think that could be quite a fun way of engaging with you all a little bit more as well. But in this video, I wanted to talk about something that has bugged me, not just in recent times, but pretty much ever since I have watched reviews on YouTube, whether that's reviews of books or reviews of music. It's something that, YouTubers say when they're reviewing something, and it is something to the effect of, don't criticize me because this is just my opinion. Or, and this is sometimes people in the comments, saying things like, oh, it's just subjective. So, you can say what you want basically when it comes to art. And this is a view that I deeply disagree with. I don't think that anything does just go when it comes to literary criticism, and I think that there are actually objective qualities when it comes to what makes a work of art a good, solid work of art. And so I wanted to talk about why I think this in this little rant of mine. So starting with the first thing, which is, why do people make this claim? I think part of it is genuine. I think usually when someone gives you an argument, I think it's good to take them on board rather than psychologizing them, as some people like to do. But I will do a little bit of psychologizing because it's fun. And what I will say is, I think sometimes this kind of view, especially when the reviewer says it, it's a way of covering yourself from hostile comments. Because, sometimes people can be quite rude when they criticize people online. And so if you say, well, it's all subjective, it's just my opinion, it sort of makes being an abusive twat a bit silly because, well, you're just criticizing someone's personal preference, which is sort of silly. So I think that's part of it. I think part of it is people just trying to cover their tracks. Unfortunately, I do think it's actually pretty disingenuous, because when I watch these reviews, most of the time, I'm not just watching someone say, I liked this book, the end. Usually they'll say things like, I didn't like this book because I thought the characters were flat. I thought the plot was obvious. I thought that the prose was written by, by a 3-year-old. I thought it needed editing, whatever it is. And so those are not personal opinions. Those are arguments that you can give, and they are supported or not supported by the text. So when someone says the characters are two-dimensional, you can't just say this. You need to actually provide evidence of that. So evidence in the text might be something like, it's a villain, and they're just evil, and there's no real motivation for why they're evil. They don't really do anything aside from, I am bad, and that's about it. That's a very flat villain, not very interesting. So that is an argument you could give for why a villain is flat. But if you just said, they're flat because I think so, and you can't criticize me, it's like, well, I mean, yes, you are entitled to say that, but no one should really listen to you because you have no reason to think this. And so it's just sort of silly at that point. And, when you actually watch reviews, people do give reasons. And that doesn't matter whether it's storytelling or people reviewing albums. When they criticize the quality of the writing, they're talking about something that you actually can say something objective about. So that's the first reason why I find this annoying, because I just find it disingenuous when it comes to the content of these reviews, where they often do give arguments which can either be right or wrong. Another reason why it's bizarre to hold this view is that if you actually hold it and you're sincere about it, then what you're essentially saying when you give a book 5 stars, for example, is just, I really liked this book. And when you give it a 1 star, you're saying, I really didn't like this book. And to be fair, a lot of, when they give you a little bit of speech, if you've got like the 5 stars on Goodreads and you hover over it, I think Goodreads does this. It'll say like, I like it, love it. So it forces you into this taste mindset, this mindset of how the book made you feel. And that to me is completely wrong, because whether or not you like something is not necessarily a good indicator as to whether or not something is a quality product. So for example, I do not like white wine. I'm a red wine drinker. I like that. I like beer. I like gin. Don't like white wine. Now, I can recognize that white wine, it can be very well made, but to me it tastes horrible. So by and large, I mean, there are some exceptions, but by and large, I'm not enjoying white wine. But I wouldn't go to a wine company who makes white wine and give them a scathing review because I just don't have the taste for their wine. That's insane. I would let the people who do like that, who can evaluate its quality, I would let those do that. Likewise, I'm not one for romance novels, by and large, some exceptions. And so, if I were to read Twilight, for example, I would have to put myself in the mindset of, okay, this isn't my personal taste. However, are the characters compelling? Is the prose well written? Blah, 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 blah. And that would be how I would have to evaluate the book. And it would be sort of wrong of me and unfair of me to Stephenie Meyer, it would be unfair of me to say she's a crap writer because I don't like, girly vampire romance books. That's just unfair to me. Fair enough, you're allowed not to like them. No one's saying you have to like her books because that's a matter of personal preference. But whether or not the book is good quality depends upon the objective qualities of the craft. And if all you're doing is saying, I just like this or I just dislike this, then all you're doing is just stating a preference. And to me, that's not interesting, and that's not what I look for in a reviewer. I don't care whether you like something. I want to know whether this is worth my reading it. And since me and you aren't the same person, I have no reason to think that just because you like something, I will. What I want you to do as a reviewer is tell me whether or not it's a good quality product, and that means talking about the actual craft of writing. Which brings me to the point, which is writing, obviously, is a craft like any other. It has rules. There are rules for constructing a good scene, a good chapter, a good overall plot arc. There are rules for good characterization, for good world building, for integrating a world into your story. A case in point, you read a fantasy novel, and the first 3 chapters are just the author lecturing you about their world. I'm sure it's a fascinating world, dear. Unfortunately, I didn't come to read a history book of your magical fantasy land. I came to read a novel, so if we could have the novel, and you can reveal the magic through the novel, great. But if you're going to do it this way, that's just objectively bad storytelling, because it's not really storytelling at that point. And so that's an example, a clear example of poor quality craft, whereas someone who integrates the world building into the narrative. I'm rereading The Wheel of Time at the minute to remind myself that the books are great, despite that terrible show. And the way that Egwene learns about the magic system, which is also when we learn about the magic system in the Eye of the World, is perfectly done. Yes, it's a bit exposition heavy, but it makes sense because she is being taken away by Moraine to learn about the magic system that she is about to embark on and learn for herself. Perfect example of how you integrate world building into a story rather than bogging people down with pages and pages of needless exposition that just breaks the story altogether. So writing really is a craft. Now, one thing that someone might say is, yeah, but like it is a craft, but then also it's creative, and there are no real rules. And when you say it's a craft, it makes it sound like you're trying to say that every book should fit into this neat little box, and that's obviously wrong, and that's obviously not the correct argument to make, because that's not the point that I'm making. Just because something is a craft, and there are certain rules for constructing a product, an artwork, whatever it is, well in that craft, it doesn't mean that you can't be creative. Some of the best works break all the rules of grammar. Think of James Joyce, think of Virginia Woolf. But the important thing is that those writers knew the craft of writing deeply well. They were very well read. They knew everything about the history of literature, and they were able to synthesize that to understand the craft so well, so they knew exactly what rules they could break. When it comes to postmodernists like Woolf, for example, she wants to have these stories, like Into the Lighthouse, that have a stream of consciousness. She wants to reflect in prose what it is like inside the human mind. And unfortunately, traditional grammar rules are not going to cut it. That's not how we think. So she breaks all of the rules of sentence construction, of plot construction, and she does that because she has a very particular perspective that she wants to manifest in her book, and so that's why that's creative. If I was to just string a load of random letters together now and say, look how creative I am, no, that's just being a random symbol generator. That's not interesting. That's not art. That's just randomly doing something and hoping it sticks. and not in an insightful way either, just in a completely blind way. There's no real craft there. There's no real skill there. And so that is the important difference. It's not that when you say something is a craft, it means it's just objective, and if you just learn the rules, that's it. It's saying that, yes, it largely is objective. There are rules to these things, but the rules are malleable. But the clever writer is one who knows which rules they can break, and the ones who break them for actual aesthetic reasons, not just breaking them willy-nilly or because they don't understand what those rules are. So the argument from creativity doesn't work. You can still have a craft and allow for creation. In fact, if you think about science, if you think about any profession, all professions work exactly the same way. Art is not very special in that regard. There are rules to doing science well, but some creative scientists might find a more effective way of doing experiments that breaks certain established rules from the past, but then we start doing it that way because it's more effective. So this really isn't anything new or unique to art, in my view, at all. I think another thing here is that people often are confusing taste with the craft of writing, or the objective aesthetic qualities of what makes a novel great. And to some degree this is fair. And it's fair to bring up taste, and you can't escape it, but there is clearly something different. For me, taste is simply about whether or not you feel personal enjoyment from something. And as I said with the wine example, you can get personal enjoyment of something or not, and that doesn't necessarily have any bearing on whether the product is good. Sometimes, if something is well constructed, that will then make you like it. But let's say that you just really hate books about war, right? You just don't care. You don't like it. You find it boring, whatever. And so someone could put forward, the most amazing book about war ever. But because it's about war, you're just not interested, right? You're not going to enjoy it because it's just not your thing. Nevertheless, you should still be able to recognize that that is a well put together book. I always struggle to get on with classical music, but I can recognize the complexity of classical music, the fact that it is deeper and richer than most popular music. I think it's true. Nevertheless, popular music moves me a lot more. And I can recognize there's a difference between the craft and the depth of certain art forms and whether or not I personally enjoy it. And I don't confuse those two things. And again, I think people do this all the time in ordinary life. You might go see a film with someone and you might think, yeah, the acting was great, the directing was great, everything was perfect, but it just didn't move me. Like, I can't relate to that. It's just not my thing. Not interesting to me. And people do this all the time. So I don't think it's an especially novel claim. Unfortunately, people seem to forget this, when they say things like, oh, it's just subjective, or when they try to, and this is something else I'll probably rant about at a future time, but when people feel this need to, just because they like something and it's their taste, they feel the need to say that it's an amazing work of art. I'm looking at you, people who think the Wheel of Time show is great. But in any case, I can deal with that another time. But we shouldn't confuse these elements of what our personal preferences are with whether or not something is an amazing work of art, whether it's well crafted and all of that great stuff. Now, what someone might say to me now is, well, you're trying to separate these two things, taste and craft and blah, 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 but you can't really disambiguate these two things because they're so intermingled, and aren't we all wonderful and, postmodern? To give that postmodern view its due, it does recognize something true, which is, yes, it can be hard sometimes to disentangle your taste from whether or not something is a good story. But again, just because things get blurred together sometimes, and just because taste can bias you in favor of or against something, it doesn't mean that you can't, with a bit of reflection and thought, consider whether or not something is a great work independently of one's biases. So, for example, when I do my ranking videos, I think I acknowledge, maybe I don't, here's my acknowledgement if I don't, but I think I do acknowledge that there is an element of my personal preferences alongside what I think are the objective qualities of the work. And the reason why I do that is because if you use a bit of a personal touch in a ranking, it can make for a slightly more interesting ranking than just the obvious one. But also, a reason why I think it's fair to do it, at least with the ranking videos that I often do, is that usually the books usually of all high quality anyway. If I'm picking a classic author, for example, like E.M. Forster, all of his books are really high quality. Some are, I would say, objectively better than others, but some it's really interchangeable. And so personal taste can just add something nice in there that gives it a bit of spice or whatever. Now, when I did my E.M. Forster ranking, I put Morris either third or second. And the reason why it was so high, I think partly, is because it is a very good book. I think it is underrated. But I also recognise that one reason why I really like Morris, and even though I ranked it maybe second or third, I would probably read it more than the books ahead of that, is because it is about experiences that I, as a gay man, can relate to more than, say, the romance in A Room with a View, where it's a heterosexual romance. That's not to say that that makes A Room with a View a bad book. It's just to say that there's something in Morris that I can personally relate to more, so it's a book that I might enjoy reading more often, even if I don't think it's Forster's best book. And so this is an example where taste can blur with whether or not you think it's a great book. Maybe I'm biased because of my preference. I don't think I am. I think the reason why that is such a good book actually is precisely because the romance is more unique. It engages with certain social stigmas and ideas and internal struggles that heterosexual people don't go through. So it's a more original and interesting novel on that basis, which is partly why I ranked it so high. But I also acknowledge that yes, maybe my biases do play into that. So yes, the boundaries are blurred, and we can talk about that and we can think about that. But that just because boundaries sometimes get blurred, and just because we have vested interests in things, it doesn't mean that everything that we say is redundant or pointless or worthless. You find this not just in the arts now, but with any political debate or scientific debate. People are always on the lookout for who's paying you to say this. And sometimes, fair enough, people get paid to say things or forced to say things. That's fine, and that's a problematic bias. But sometimes people do just have good arguments for things. And as I said at the beginning, as much as I do think part of the reason for why people make these claims is to cover themselves, maybe just take people at face value when they when they say things, when they present arguments, when they present you with arguments for a position, whether that's about science or about whether or not something is a good or bad book. But in any case, those are all my somewhat rambled and jumbled thoughts on this. Ultimately, I do think that writing is a craft. I do think it is something that is objective. I do think that taste exists and preference exists, but I think that is a separate question. Whether or not you like something doesn't always map onto whether it's good. I might love McDonald's, it's still terrible for me, and I probably shouldn't eat it. I love cheesy 80s horror movies that are usually quite badly acted, but I just like that acting. It's cheesy and silly, and I just find it amusing. I'm not going to say that they're great films in the objective sense of great storytelling, great acting, whatever. They're cheesy. And I think it's important to make those distinctions and to recognize that. And I don't think it necessarily diminishes anyone. I don't think it's elitist. And in fact, I think it just gives artists their due, because artists work really hard to produce quality work. And for you just to say that it's all subjective and blah, 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 personal opinion, it's kind of insulting, because then you kind of wonder then, why do they bother crafting anything? Why do they bother trying? If it's just a matter of personal taste, then there's nothing really to get better at, is there? Let me know down in the comments, what do you think? Am I a raging elitist? Or do I actually talk sense on this topic? Or is it all just subjective anyway, and it doesn't really matter, and so you can't really criticize me, and we should just leave it there? And also, if you have any questions or topics that you want me to discuss in this more offhand manner, let me know down in the comments. I look forward to making those videos for you in the future. Take care, everyone. Ta-ra.